Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, France says it has proof that the Syrian government used chemical weapons against civilians in Douma last weekend. The French President Emmanuel Macron has vowed to respond to the attack, but stopped short of saying when.
We have the proof that last week, now almost 10 days, chemical weapons were used, at least chlorine. They were used by the Assad regime. We will need to take decisions in due course when we judge it to be most useful and effective.
Well, the US is still deciding on its response, with President Trump again using Twitter to relay his position on Syria after warning Russia to get ready for military action yesterday. This morning he tweeted, "Never said when an attack on Syria would take place. Could be very soon or not so soon at all. In any event, the United States, under my administration, has done a great job of ridding the region of ISIS. Where is our thank you, America?" Well, here, the Prime Minister is due to chair an emergency cabinet meeting on the crisis as she considers joint military action. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has led calls for MPs in the Commons to be given a vote on any decision that's made.
Parliament must be consulted on this. Surely the lessons of Iraq, the lessons that came there from the Chilcot report have got to be, there has to be a proper process of consultation. We elect Parliament, we elect members of Parliament, they should have a voice in this. The Cabinet on its own should not be making this decision.
Well, in a moment, we're going to speak to our political correspondent, Jason Farrell, who's at Downing Street, and our US correspondent, Mark Austin, who's in Washington. But first, let's go live to Paris and our senior correspondent, Michelle Clifford. So, Michelle, Emmanuel Macron saying, we have proof and we want international action.
Yes, and he made that comment in a sit-down interview with one of the television channels here in France. He doesn't actually do those big set pieces very often, but today he's been talking not just about Syria, but a lot of his domestic problems. He's juggling lots of different things. But on the issue of Syria, he said, we have proof. And of course, that's a very potent statement in terms of justifying any push towards a military action. I think there is a general expectation here in France now that that will happen. I think people are relieved that there is no longer a suggestion that France would act unilaterally, but it will go at the very least into any military action with the US, possibly the UK. He didn't give any indication of when that would happen. He simply said that he's in constant contact with President Trump and they will decide between them when is the most effective time. He is very firm about the need for military action against Syria. Why? Well, I've been talking to people who know him, and including one military advisor who helped him in terms of defence during the election campaign. And he said to me there are two big reasons. One is the moral imperative. He set down a red line about the use of chemical weapons and he wants to stick to it. That's one factor. The other is a strategic motivation. He sees himself very much as the Western leader, the European leader who can talk to everyone. He's forged a very close alliance with President Trump, and when he goes to Washington later this year, he will want to exert leverage on President Trump in terms of the Iran nuclear deal. So it suits him to be very close to the US at the moment. So people have an expectation something's going to happen. Does it mean everybody here is happy about it? Not at all. We've been talking to people on the streets of Paris today. Many of them have reservations. And I think particularly the concern is about the possibility of some kind of retaliation in terms of a terrorist attack. Obviously, France is a country that has suffered terrorist attacks in recent years, and people are concerned about that. Let's have a listen to what some of them had to say.
I wouldn't think it's a good idea because every form of violence would involve another sort of violence back. So I think every sort of violence should be avoided as maximum as possible. Wars never did any good to anyone. So
we see everywhere in the world go more like this, more in this way, to don't think and go and just do the war. So it's very sad.
It depends on if Syria has enough forces or not, if they have enough to defend themselves or not. But I don't think that countries should get involved in other countries' business.
So there is concern, but I think there is, as I said earlier, I think there is a general acceptance something is going to happen. They're waiting for President Macron to tell them or when, or have heard about the attacks when they happen. In terms of other European leaders, Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany said today, while she supports sending a signal to Syria because of the use of chemical weapons, Germany will not be taking part in any kind of military action. So I think in terms of the European perspective, certainly looking to France in terms of taking part, possibly the UK and certainly the US.
OK, Michelle, thank you very much. Well, we have been hearing from the Russian Foreign Ministry. A spokeswoman there, Maria Zakharov, has been speaking, and she is saying that threats by USA and France to strike Syria are a violation of the UN Charter. Let's go to Downing Street. You just saw Jason Farrell there. Jason, the UK is due to meet. Theresa May has called a meeting of the War Cabinet. When are we expecting that to happen?
That's going to happen in about an hour from now. The Cabinet will get together. It's one of those days when you see a bank of cameras down Downing Street. There's a full complement of international media here today, just emphasising really the importance of the meeting that's going to be happening here this afternoon, because Theresa May has to decide now whether the UK is going to back this military action, if indeed the US goes ahead with it. In what way will the UK do so? Will they be in a support role, or will they be involved, for example, in launching missiles from their jets that are currently stationed in Cyprus? Or there are reports of a UK submarine heading to the region that, again, obviously would have the capability to launch missiles. So there's a lot of decisions around what kind of military action might be taken, what the UK would be prepared to get involved in. Second question, of course, is whether this should be put to a parliamentary vote. Certainly there's been no indication of a recall of Parliament, and so it would have to be when Parliament returns on Monday. That may well be after the event, and a lot of politicians you heard earlier, Jeremy Corbyn, saying that that would be unacceptable. The SNP agree. There's also some of the Conservative figures speaking out, such as Zach Goldsmith, who has tweeted today that he thinks there should be involvement from Parliament, and also that the government should put forward, if they are going to take action, who benefits from Assad being depleted. So in other words, exactly who are we supporting? And I was speaking to Junior Lewis, also a Conservative chair of the Defence Committee, who again said there are only monsters and maniacs in this conflict, as he put it, and the UK should not be getting involved in a civil war. There should be finding perhaps a way of punishing the use of chemical weapons, but there's a little bit of anxiety around the use of them in this conflict, particularly, of course, because of the Russian presence there, and the fear that even if it were inadvertent, that Russian troops on the ground who are embedded with the Syrian military could get killed or harmed in this, and that could lead to retaliatory action. So there is an awful lot for Theresa May to consider. That parliamentary vote is an interesting one, because even some of her own cabinet, David Davis, for example, voted against military action back in 2013. And earlier he was spoken to. We can hear what he had to say and why he's changed his mind from the view he took when David Cameron tried to take this to Parliament back in 2013. Let's hear from him.
One was because we hadn't provided the evidence and intelligence that we knew who it was. And secondly, because there was not a proper plan which was thought through properly. Those two things, I'm sure, we're going to answer today.
So quite interesting there. David Davis saying that not only will there be potentially a decision, but there will be an outline of exactly what the plan is and why that plan is better than what David Cameron proposed back in 2013 when this was voted down in Parliament. OK, Jason, thanks a lot.
Let's go to Washington now, and our US correspondent Mark Austin is there. Mark, another day, another Donald Trump tweet. He's up, he's tweeting, and he said, I never said when these strikes were going to be. It could be soon or not so soon at all. Mark, is this a climb down?
I don't think it's a climb down. I think there is a, confusion, maybe a mixed message. He said earlier in the week that he would decide in 24, 48 hours on military action. That didn't happen because we're still told all options are on the table. He then said yesterday morning in a tweet that the missiles were coming. He warned Putin and he warned Russia the missiles were coming. He was accused of sort of signaling America's military intent. Now he says it may be soon or it may be not so soon. It does rather give the impression of an American president racing ahead on this, ahead of his allies, Britain and France, who are being more cautious, seeking more evidence, seeking more verification. And, you know, that's a problem because it also gives this impression of, you know, an alliance slightly out of sync. And it also gives the Syrian forces and Russian forces more time to organize their defenses, more time perhaps to hide chemical weapons if they exist. And so, you know, Donald Trump is being criticized slightly, but there is a bigger picture here which is emerging, and that is, what is the strategy post any a military strike? What's the strategy of the US? Is the strategy still, as it's been for the last few years, to get rid of Assad? Is the strategy to remove chemical weapons from Syria once and for all? Or is it, as it was a year ago, a limited military strike to degrade Syria's military infrastructure and to deter him from using chemical weapons again? Well, that failed. So what is the strategy? And we learned from Iraq that you need a post-military action strategy. There wasn't really one in Iraq. Is there one now? And that, I think, is something that Donald Trump has got to be thinking about, certainly something that Theresa May and her cabinet has got to be thinking about. It's all complicated because Donald Trump said last week he wants all American troops out of Syria. He said, I want out and soon. So that complicates any thought of a long-term strategy that involves the American military. So it is all becoming very complicated. But look, the die seems cast. Donald Trump is meeting his National Security Council later today. Theresa May has her cabinet meeting. So it does look like there will be a military strike sometime in the next few days, and increasingly it looks like it will involve Britain and certainly France, who, if anything, seem to be taking the lead on this. But Donald Trump, very important meeting later today with the National Security Council.
OK, Mark, thanks a lot. OK, well, let's go. I was talking to you about the foreign ministry in Russia. They're giving a press conference. The foreign ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, is speaking. Let's have a listen to what she's saying.
Was done for this decision to be taken. And some hours passed, some time passed, and now we have the details of this fabrication. And when we attempted to contact the heads of this organization, the World Health Organization, the Director General, Adhan, and his deputy, Salam, were not available for comments, and they were not in Geneva at the time. He had some sources on the basis of which they made such a conclusion. At the same time, to call the partners from this World Health sector, they failed to mention them, and they failed to name the medical centers where these 500 victims were taken, and they didn't clarify who counted the number of victims, who established and determined the diagnosis and the causes of death. They said that these are highly reliable sources, but we know the value of such sources. And we regard it as an attempt to disseminate an ungrounded information which incites to new aggressive actions. And we urge the World Health Organization to show impartiality and not to be basing on the organizations that have caused discredit upon themselves, but on the opinion of the experts who can come to any conclusion only after a detailed work.
So that was Maria Zakharova. She's the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson. And she was just talking there very briefly about disputing claims of accounts of what actually happened in Duma in Eastern Ghouta over the weekend and calling for an investigation, calling on the WHO to be impartial. We're going to leave what Maria is saying there, and we're going to speak to Dr. Talal Nizamuddin. Obviously, Russia's Vladimir Putin is extremely important in all of this. And Dr. Talal has written a book called Putin's New Order in the Middle East. Talal, would Bashar al-Assad be in power if Vladimir Putin had not gone in to help him militarily?
I think we know the answer to that one. It's pretty conclusive. No, he would not be. Russia entered at a decisive stage in the conflict when it looked like the opposition forces were about to succeed, were about to change the regime. You know, Russia has been wholly responsible for keeping the Assad regime in power, not only, you know, saving it at the time, but also keeping it in power for the following years.
Mm-hmm. So what is Vladimir Putin's end game here?
I think he has several objectives. The two international ones are essentially, first of all, a foothold in the Middle East, a return to be a major player in Middle East politics, which arguably he has succeeded in doing, at least in the short term. And the second, internationally, more globally, which many would argue is more important, is a global balance with the United States to undermine the West, to undermine the United States and Europe, so that, you know, in his view, in the view of his specific clique of policy advisors, the weaker the West is, the stronger Russia becomes. It's a zero-sum game for them, so that if we divide up the Europeans, if we split the Europeans and the Americans, if we put doubt in the minds of Westerners about their own government's intentions, we become stronger and we are able to have more of an open playing field for ourselves. So I think those are two crucial strategic objectives internationally. And internally, of course, it's Putin's strongest asset, to be the macho man, chest-beating, you know, Western-defeating great leader. It's great publicity, it's great media, the Russians love it, they voted for him. By how much, we don't know, but clearly he has support, nationalist support because of it. Because there's not much else to show for it inside Russia. Corruption is as bad as it was during the Yeltsin era. The economy is stagnant. So, you know, it's a card winner in his mind, at least in the short term.
We saw him meeting with the Iranians, with the Turks. How committed is he? Out of that meeting, there was this sense that it was about a political solution to the end of what is now a 7-year civil war in Syria. How committed do you think Vladimir Putin is to seeing a political solution to what's happening?
I think, you know, the pragmatist in Putin would want to see an end to this. He doesn't want to see the remaining 6 years, according to the constitution, probably his last, unless he changes the constitution again. He doesn't want to be mired in the Syrian conflict for all that time. But I think, again, it depends on how we define political solution. For the Turks and the Iranians and the Russians, each have their own objectives. For the Turks, it's the Kurdish problem primarily. For the Iranians, it's access to the Mediterranean through Syria and Lebanon. For the Russians, as I mentioned, I think they have those objectives. None of them have political solutions which arguably, you know, the Westerners would like to see, the Western governments, primarily Britain, France, and the United States, which is a viable political system for the future that allows a genuine opposition in Syria to have a say in the future of their country.
Talal, do you think airstrikes are the answer here? Given what allegedly happened in Duma over the weekend, do you think airstrikes are the answer?
The trouble is, it's very easy for many people. It's very, I listen to some of the comments. It's of course, we all say we don't like war and it's not a solution and so forth. But there is a basic problem, and that is, chemical weapons are being used against civilians, and there needs to be accountability in that. I think it's important to mention Israel here as well, which I think conducted its own strikes a few days ago. Now we know that Syria does have stockpiles, or there are stockpiles in Syria, which was Russia's responsibility. That was part of the agreement with the Americans, after Obama's red line. So I think it's inevitable, and I think there really is no other option for the West but to hold primarily Russia more than the Syrians accountable, that the situation in Syria is not only chaotic and in terms of human rights and the human impact on the people is unacceptable, but also that it poses grave dangers for the region and also, beyond, for the Europeans and beyond.
Okay. Talal and Nizamuddin, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We're going to move on now, and France says it has proved that the Syrian government used chemical weapons against civilians in Douma last weekend. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, has vowed to respond to the attack, but stopped short of saying when. The US President, Donald Trump, has also said that he'll launch airstrikes, and the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, is due to recall cabinet to consider the UK's options. Our defence correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, is here now with more on those military options.
Yeah, let's look at them and take them one by one. One option is to carry out a limited strike on the specific base where the chemical attack was launched from last weekend. Now, we don't know where that is, but it's a pretty safe bet to assume that American, British and French intelligence do have some idea. Last year, that is exactly what President Trump did when he ordered Tomahawk cruise missiles to strike the Al-Shairat base after a chemical attack. Now, I would suggest that's a fairly low-risk option, but also low impact. Ultimately, the strike last year was not enough to stop President Assad using chemical weapons, and the damage that was done to the runway was fixed within about 24 hours anyway. So another bigger option for President Trump is the potential of delivering something of a killer blow to Syria's air force. There are 24 airfields across Syria. We've mapped them out there. This is a high-risk option. The reason for that is the more places you bomb, the more chance you have of killing Russian troops who are embedded on those bases. A third option, I think a relatively unlikely option, would to be go further still and target government infrastructure. For example, the Ministry of Defence in Damascus, or perhaps Damascus International Airport. That is quite a key hub for Russia and Iran flying in supplies, so you could put that out of action. I think probably, given what we're hearing out of Paris and Washington in particular, the most unlikely option is the option of doing nothing at all. Why? Well, I think Trump and Macron and May will see that is a way of letting President Assad get away with the chemical attacks. The one in Khan Shaykhun last year, and of course the one in Douma in eastern Ghouta just a few days ago that's precipitated this spiral of events. So if America and her allies of France and the UK do choose to launch airstrikes, how might they operate and where from? Let's take the Americans first. They've got a base down southeast of there in Qatar. Al Udeid Air Force Base is actually a coalition base, but a big concentration of US forces are there, including, incidentally, the hotline between coalition forces and Russia to coordinate action over Syria. We're told that that channel is still open. There is also a guided missile destroyer in the eastern Mediterranean, the USS Donald Cook. It left the port of Larnaca a couple of days ago, so possibly it is in position now. She has Tomahawk missiles on board. They've got a range of 1,000 kilometres. How about the UK? Well, let's still keep our focus on Cyprus and RAF Akrotiri, the base for 8 Tornadoes and 6 Typhoon fighter jets. Refuelling aircraft are also based there, as is a Sentinel spy plane. Neither of those get quite as much attention, but they would be crucial if you were conducting a series of strikes over a number of days. The French, finally, have around a dozen Rafale jets split between a base in the United Arab Emirates and up there in Jordan. They also have the option of an asset in the Mediterranean. The L'Aquitaine, a frigate that has cruise missiles on board, is currently in international waters. Now, we've seen the potential options and the scale of risk attached to those options. What about the threat, though? That comes primarily from Russia, and in particular, an airbase they have on the western coast, Latakia, which is also the location for the S-400 surface-to-air missile batteries. Now, these are a highly advanced piece of kit, probably the best anti-aircraft piece of technology in the world. It has a radar that covers a vast area, taking in including the British base at Akrotiri there, so it would monitor everything taking off and landing. Its missiles have a range of around 250 miles. They can travel at 6 times the speed of sound and engage 36 targets at any one time. So there you have it. There is a lot of risk attached to attacking Syria, whichever way you do it. The governments of the United States, the United Kingdom and France need to weigh up whether that risk is worth it.
Thanks, Alistair.
On our top story, as the Prime Minister chairs a cabinet meeting to discuss whether to join France and the US in possible military action against Syria over a suspected chemical attack. Joining me from our central London studio is Middle East writer Carl Sharrow. Hello to you, Carl. Thanks for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Having seen those attacks over the weekend, there's no choice, according to much of the West, including, it would seem, our Prime Minister. She's saying that to her cabinet right now. Is she right?
No, I don't think so, really. I think we need to practice a lot of caution in this period, not to be drawn into what is, after all, I feel, a knee-jerk reaction, because Syria has been going on for 7 years now. It's a pretty complicated situation, and I think persistently the West's action in there have tended to make the situation more complicated. And I worry about being drawn into this knee-jerk reaction, you know, as a form of posturing to show we're the good guys, we're helping out. We might actually make the situation worse, and we end up in an escalation that cannot be controlled. So I would advise a lot of caution, because before we get sucked into another adventure that will make the situation in Syria more complicated, but also draw unintended consequences that we might all face out of it.
What's the alternative?
Well, I think there are many alternatives. I mean, I hear a lot now about, you know, the necessity of doing something and, you know, our moral obligations to the Syrian people. And I totally support that. But I don't understand why that has always to manifest itself in military strikes. I think we have a diplomatic means, we have political means, we have humanitarian means. Why is it always, does it have to be the military answer first? And let me give you just an example. The Western power have kind of completely left a vacuum in terms of whatever diplomatic solution for Syria is being prepared, which is currently being led by Russia and Turkey and Iran collaboratively, and the West has completely disappeared out of that. So I think it's much more of a priority for the UK and Western powers generally to try to regain or aid, if you like, this finding a solution for Syria in diplomatic means, humanitarian means, political means. Those are much more important aspects rather than a kind of a feel-good military strike that might have very negative consequences.
I wonder if they would describe it as feel-good. Perhaps the president's tweets, perhaps not so much with the United Kingdom. But what, from the suggestions that you have made, those are implemented, put into place, and have been for the last several years, if not 7 years. But Assad is still dropping chemical weapons and barrel bombs on his own people. He can't continue to be allowed to do that.
Yes, but I think, you know, we need to be very cautious in understanding what brought us to this point. And if you look at how the situation in Syria escalated progressively from 2011, I think there had been a lot of kind of unwise meddling by Western powers, which did have an impact on changing the nature of what started as peaceful uprising and quickly kind of escalated into a civil war / regional war. So, for example, you talk about the intervention, the Iranian intervention. the perceived support by Western powers for the rebels kind of drew a reaction. Russia entered as well because what it seemed to be an escalation from the Western side. So anytime you escalate in this situation, there's bound to be a kind of reciprocal escalation. And I don't see any way at this stage, after 7 years, of kind of a further military escalation that will end to calming down of the situation or to restricting Bashar al-Assad's capability. I mean, when there are no chemical attacks happening, there are hundreds of people dying in Syria every day using conventional weapons, and that somehow doesn't seem to be outrageous. But I think more importantly, we need to focus on one aspect, which is the kind of the lack of clarity, again, broadly from the West about what the outcome that they wanted in Syria. I think we are in this situation today because Russia and its allies have a very clear understanding. I mean, it's not necessarily a benevolent one, but they have an outcome, a desired outcome, whereas we've seen the Western powers kind of this incessant meddling with no clarity, and Obama was kind of very hesitant to intervene precisely for that because he didn't see any viable alternatives to Assad at this stage. And I don't see anything has changed since that period. So again, I would say, where is the long-term strategy, and why do we have to keep on those kind of very short-termist reactions?
Is that a good enough reason not to carry out airstrikes because there's no viable alternative to Assad? You're worried about a power vacuum like we saw in Libya and also in Iraq. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. But also that will escalate further. So some people are assuming that if we kind of, whatever that precise nature of that military action is, be it, you know, cruise missiles or targeting Assad's air force, which, by the way, now has been kind of taken into hiding. So I don't know how effective that will be. That in its own, we can't assume that will lead to a military supremacy or a military solution. We've seen previously in the past all these adventures go wrong, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya more recently under very similar circumstances. So why would anyone assume that a very short-termist, targeted, smart, whatever you want to call it, military strike is suddenly going to be, you know, no pun intended, the magic bullet? I think we need to have a much more a kind of long-termist view of this.
Okay, Mr. Sharrow, sadly we are out of time, but I'm sure we'll discuss this plenty more over the coming days and weeks. Appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. Get the perspective now from someone who has survived a chemical weapons attack. Qasim Aid almost died in a sarin gas attack in Syria in 2013. He joins us from Washington. Hi, Qasim. Thank you for joining us on Sky News. First of all, tell us what happened to you.
Thank you for having me. After living under 2 years of Assad bombardment and siege, in August 21st, 2013, Assad has launched a sarin gas attack against our town and other towns in eastern Ghouta. I got exposed to sarin gas, and it was the most painful thing I ever been through. I always describe that day as Judgment Day. Men, women, and children were running, screaming, falling on the ground, choking, suffocating without knowing what happened. The burning sensation in my lungs, in my eyes, in my heart is something that I will never forget. But the most painful thing about the memory of that day was holding a little boy who was suffocating and staring in his glassy eyes, in his face that was colored with all colors of terror and fear. And just simply trying to understand, how could anyone do that to someone else? How can you suffocate children? How can you choke them while they're sleeping? How can you bomb and rape and gas hundreds of thousands of people and pretend that you're fighting terrorism while you are the real terrorist? Few days after I survived the attack, I also helped the OPCW when they arrived to Maddamiyeh to examine the evidence and examine the missiles that the Assad regime has used. And they examined patients. They took blood samples. And gathered data from Maddamiyeh until the regime started bombing our town again forcing them to leave. I have total faith in OPCW, and I know they are super professional, and they truly risked their lives back in 2013 to actually investigate that hideous crime against humanity. But unfortunately, all what we got is a broken promise from Obama's red line and a lying deal with the Russians back in 2014, saying that they're going to take Assad chemical weapons stock. 4 years later, 5 years later, thousands of people kept getting killed by chemical weapons, by chlorine gas and sarin gas and mustard gas and God knows what gas, because until now we are not allowed to investigate, to properly investigate the crimes in Syria. 3 days ago, for your dear audience, this is something very important to know, almost 2 days after the chemical massacre, 3 days ago, Putin sent his military police to Duma, to the same place where it got hit with chemical weapons when they denied the use of chemical weapons. They sent their military police to literally gather and destroy the evidence. My friends inside Duma filmed the Russian military police while they were going to those sites. They also held the doctors who were helping and treating patients during the chemical attack hostage in Damascus. So if someone is listening from the OPCW or from whoever is pretending that they actually care about Syria, why don't you go to the hospitals and look for the doctors of Duma? Why don't you go to the sites and actually try to talk to people away from Assad? There is a lot of patients who got exposed to sarin, and they're now, they made it out of to Turkey with the help of some good people. So we have evidence, just like we have evidence over 200 documented use of chemical weapons in Syria. Putin and Assad and Iran are war criminals. They should be held accountable. Otherwise, we're just going to give ISIS another excuse to come and tell people that the West and the international community doesn't care about you and we're the only ones here to help. Inaction in Syria means fueling ISIS 2.0. So for with all due respect to idiots like Nigel Farage and others, when Hitler was bombing and gassing and torturing millions of Jews back in World War II, there were voices in the world saying that it didn't happen, or maybe it's not our problem, or maybe we should just move on and send them some aid. And after a devastating war and 70 million people got killed, we learned a valuable lesson. Never again means never again. Never let dictators kill people and commit war crimes unaccountable, because that will send the world into chaos. And the past 7 years, inaction in Syria has helped creating ISIS and fueling extremists, not just in the Middle East. We're seeing the rise of the alt-right in Europe, in the States, all over the world. Extremists are fueling themselves with inaction. It's time for humanity to show criminals like Assad that enough is enough, that it's about time for Assad to be held accountable for his war crimes. There is a crematorium in Sednaya that the U.S. intelligence just announced the information about last summer. That crematorium, Assad burned and killed 100,000 people in Sednaya. I've told the U.S. State Department about that site back in 2014 during meetings after I just fled Syria and I managed to escape from the Assad regime and Hezbollah in Lebanon. All what I got is just broken promises and some notes and some just sympathy words. 2 months ago, I was at Ambassador Nikki Haley's office in New York, and I warned her assistants about an upcoming chemical attack because I still have friends on the ground in Syria and also inside the Syrian government who informed me, and they completely
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Kassim, but I've given you an opportunity to explain exactly how you're feeling about it, a whole range of issues there. One wonders what you would say to the British people, that if they say they completely understand what has happened to you, to those that were near and dear to you, and you've eloquently expressed what has happened to you with the sarin gas attack. And I can see from your heavy breathing just how much, when you remember what happened to you, how it still affects you very deeply. But one wonders, here in the United Kingdom and in other parts of Europe as well, whether even if these military attacks, if we did see them take place by the United States, by the United Kingdom and by France, it led to a greater war, if you will. Would that be worth it, in your opinion?
Well, with all due respect, leaving, again, dictators unpunished and unchallenged will only fuel extremist groups like ISIS. If we dealt with Assad back in 2011, when millions of Syrians were just asking for democracy and some political freedom, and we could have saved 700,000 lives and millions of refugees and the total existence of terrorist groups like ISIS. But because we waited so far, it became so much complicated to actually intervene. What we truly want right now is just not just a military strike against Assad. We need real commitment from the international community to actually bring war criminals into justice, and not just Assad. Absolutely. I'm talking about Assad, opposition, ISIS, anyone who did war crimes.
I hear you, but the question also then has to follow that Russia has said that actually it is nothing to do with President Assad, what happened in Duma at the weekend, which led to those appalling deaths and so many hundreds of people being injured. It was, in fact, the white helmets that were responsible, and that they have proof for that. They're doing that in order to undermine President Assad.
Well, you saw what happened in the UK, how they poisoned that Russian spy and totally denied that it even happened. Later on, they said, maybe someone else did it, we can help. Now, the OPCW, just today, they announced the confirmation of use of chemical weapons in that attack. Putin and Assad are masters of propaganda. They are the same people who's been killing and waging wars all over the world and fueling extremist groups. An act against Assad in Syria, against war criminals in Syria, will also help securing the national security of the United Kingdom, because sending a powerful message to dictators or criminals that the use of chemical weapons is a red line will actually stop any future attacks, rather in the UK or anywhere else. So anyone who's listening, what's going on in Syria concerns each and every one of you, because it became such a big problem that it cannot be contained by silence and just praying for things to get better.
OK, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Sky News this afternoon. We'll have to wait and hear what our Prime Minister and her Cabinet have decided. But for now, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We do appreciate it. Thank you. Within the last few moments, Donald Trump has been speaking primarily about Syria. What happens next? Here we go.
We're having a meeting today on Syria. We're having a number of meetings today. We'll see what happens. We're obviously looking at that very closely, and I will be leaving here. I was there, and now I'll be going back as soon as this meeting is over. But we're looking very, very seriously, very closely at that whole situation, and we'll see what happens, folks. We'll see what happens. It's too bad that the world puts us in a position like that, but you know, as I said this morning, we've done a great job with ISIS. We have just absolutely decimated ISIS, but now we have to make some further decisions. So they'll be made fairly soon. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Too much away, but we are being told that potentially action will be taken soon. In what form, we have no idea. We also know that our Prime Minister is meeting with her cabinet. She's recalled members of her cabinet. We're calling it a war cabinet. For shorthand for you, what's going to happen as far as that's concerned? Our correspondents and indeed our political editor is outside number 10. He'll be updating us very shortly. As far as the French are concerned, they say that they have proof that as far as the chemicals were being used in Duma at the weekend that claimed so many lives, hundreds of other people were injured, many of them incredibly seriously. Chemical attack was the result of President Assad's actions. What is the West going to do next? Stay tuned and find out.
President Trump has said decisions on how to respond to the chemical attack in Syria will be made soon. His Defence Secretary Jim Mattis said no decision had yet been made to launch military attacks and that the options would be discussed at a meeting of the National Security Council today. President Macron of France said they had proof the Syrian government carried out the chemical attack and asserted that France and the US would react at a time of their choosing. Syria has said international chemical weapons experts are due to arrive in the country today and tomorrow to examine the affected site for themselves. Here's our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen.
In the streets of Duma, supporters of President Assad paraded. The town's been a no-go area for them for more than 6 years. Russian troops are close by, alongside their Syrian allies. Moscow denies there was a chemical attack here. In Washington, President Trump's morning tweet was less belligerent. He posted, "Never said when an attack on Syria would take place. Could be very soon, or not so soon at all." Later, President Trump didn't give much more away.
We're looking very, very seriously, very closely at that whole situation, and we'll see what happens, folks. We'll see what happens. It's too bad that the world puts us in a position like that.
Congressman, the U.S. Defense Secretary hinted at a delay to wait for evidence from the bomb site.
There was a chemical attack, and we're looking for the actual evidence. The OPCW, this is the Organization for the Chemical Weapons Convention. We're trying to get those inspectors in probably within the week.
In Damascus, President Assad projected a calm face, greeting a top advisor to Iran's supreme leader. But Syrian forces are reported to be moving out of bases and installations that could be potential targets. In Moscow, the foreign ministry is adamant they're facing a Western provocation.
We are not seeking an escalation, but we also will not support false accusations.
On French TV, President Macron tried to reassure those who worry more war in Syria could lead to disaster.
What we're doing today, and what we'll have to do in Syria, is to stick to our priorities and to ensure the maximum stability in the region. In no case will France allow an escalation or anything else that could destabilize the region to take place.
Another possible reason for delaying an attack, the Americans only dispatched a carrier battle group from Norfolk, Virginia, 24 hours ago.
I'm so pleased and proud of the Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group team, 6,500 of the finest Americans you could ever sail with or serve with. We're trained, we're ready, any mission, anytime, anywhere, we're ready to go.
They're determined, but with more than 5,000 miles at sea ahead of them. The Americans, British and French between them could attack Syria without a US carrier, probably very soon. But hitting the Syrian regime without making the lives of civilians worse will be difficult, and generals, admirals and politicians might want more time to think. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
Well, in a moment, we'll speak to our Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg. But first to our North America editor, John Sopel in Washington. And John, what are we to make of the changes of tone coming from the US?
Well, I get a sense, Rita, the sound of brakes being applied. Not screeching tyre marks, black skid marks on the road, but certainly a slowing of momentum. If you just think back, Sunday, Donald Trump says there is going to be a big price to pay for this alleged chemical weapons attack. Yesterday, he was talking about those missiles, nice, new and smart, that would be raining down. And I think that seemed to have been a turning point almost at the White House, because last night at the White House they were talking about all options being on the table, no decisions being made. You heard that again from the President today, and you heard from the Defence Secretary, as we heard there in Jeremy Bowen's report, of him saying we're looking for evidence that there was a chemical weapons attack. Now, does that mean the Americans aren't going to attack until such times as they have got evidence? That all points to this slowing down. Now, if you're being kind, you'd say maybe this is the fog of war. Keep the enemy guessing. The other interpretation, though, is that there is still a degree of indecision and a degree of confusion over what to do next.
And Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, what's the mood where you are?
Well, you know, if Donald Trump's aim via Twitter is to spread chaos and confusion about his intentions, it's certainly working here in Moscow, because the Russians are mightily confused. I was watching a live political talk show earlier today on Russian state television when the news came in that President Trump had tweeted that an attack on Syria could happen very soon or not soon at all. And the presenter looked to the camera, seemed very confused, and basically said one word, "Kruto," which means incredible. She smiled in disbelief. And the Russians don't know what to believe. Will there be an attack? Won't there be an attack? One other interesting thing happened today. The Kremlin said that a special crisis communications link that had been set up before by the Russian and US militaries to ensure there could be no accidental clash in Syria. The Kremlin said that line was still operational, it was still being used, and that suggests that perhaps conversations are taking place behind the scenes to ensure that if there is a US strike on Syria, that doesn't spark an accidental conflict between Russia and the United States.
Steve, thank you. Steve Rosenberg there in Moscow, and thank you too to John Sopel in Washington. Well, here, Theresa May and her ministers have gathered at a special cabinet meeting to discuss Britain's response to events in Syria. There have been calls from opposition parties and some Conservatives for MPs to get a vote before the UK joins any military action. From Westminster, here's our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar.
Secretary of State, is the military ready? Things to do, bombing raids to support. The Defence Secretary, the whole Cabinet called in today to discuss and approve Britain's part in any airstrikes in Syria. Is bombing the answer?
I'm just going to go straight in.
Ministers met to see the intelligence showing the Assad regime was behind the chemical attack that killed dozens. A lone protester tried to get in the way and failed. Inside the Cabinet, one who'd opposed airstrikes 5 years ago had changed his mind. Why?
For two reasons. One was because we hadn't provided the evidence and intelligence that we knew who it was, and secondly because there was not a proper plan which was thought through properly. Those two things, I'm sure, we're going to answer today.
No sight or word from the Prime Minister yet, so a former Tory leader passed on the message. Action was justified. Swift action.
These are a real and genuine threat to everybody. They cannot be used. They've been used in Salisbury against British citizens. We need to put our foot down now, and we need to strike their ability to use them, stockpile them, manufacture them, or deliver them. And I think that is the key element of what action should be taken.
So no obvious problem with Cabinet approval. Mrs May supports urgent action to prevent another chemical attack. And remember, the military need clear justification for offensive operations. But Parliament is having to wait, maybe till after the bombing. The Labour leader believes he speaks for people who want peace and a bigger role for Parliament.
More bombing, more killing, more war will not save life. We elect members of Parliament. They should have a voice in this. The Cabinet on its own should not be making this decision.
In the last few moments, the Cabinet meeting has ended. Meanwhile, MPs on all sides are weighing up their position for and against airstrikes. Many want to say before it happens.
You always need parliamentary approval if you're planning the use of significant military force for policy reasons. We're a modern parliamentary democracy.
We know about the consequences of intervening. Syria stands as a test case about the consequences of not intervening.
The position is a very dangerous one because of Russian involvement, also because we have a very erratic President of the United States. I don't rule out the fact that the Liberal Democrats might support the government if a case is made, but it's got to be made.
The last Tory Prime Minister lost a vote on Syria in 2013. Will Parliament back Mrs May? Well, if military action goes according to plan, some Tories may swallow any doubts, and MPs on both sides may hesitate before denying British forces political cover. But Mrs May will be accused by critics of bypassing Parliament and dancing to Donald Trump's tune. With national influence at stake, the Prime Minister was keen to back up her American ally. Britain is heading for conflict, abroad and at home. The only question now is when. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, Jeremy Bowen, our Middle East editor, is here with me now. And Jeremy, the overall momentum for a military response does seem to have slowed a bit today. What's your assessment of what's going on?
Well, think of everything as a great big tangle and trying to untangle parts of it. You know, a lot of this may be disinformation. They may be planning to do something very quickly and they're just putting out a big fog to suggest that that's not the case. That could be one thing. You know, I think that what they're facing, though, is a very difficult and potentially dangerous operation. I've spent a lot of time in Syria during the war, and I can tell you the country is heavily militarized. And there are also, of course, civilians there who've suffered enormously. And since the whole point of what they're planning is to try to take the pressure off civilians, take away the threat of chemical weapons, to try, if not to make their lives better, then certainly not to make them worse, then perhaps they are hoping for some kind of a delay that will give them time to get more information. Those inspectors who are going in are people who decide if chemicals were used, but they don't say who actually did it. So, you know, we may wait a few more days.
OK, Jeremy, thank you.
Theresa May's cabinet spent more than 2 hours this afternoon in a special meeting to discuss military strikes against President Assad's forces. Ministers are expected to back her plan for the UK to join action threatened by the United States and its allies. But opposition parties have demanded that Parliament be recalled so that MPs have a vote before any British missiles are fired. Our political correspondent Michael Crick has the very latest.
At the entrance to Downing Street, blocking the Home Secretary's car this afternoon, a lone protester against Britain taking military action.
Are you convinced of the case for military action?
With Theresa May now convinced by intelligence that the Assad regime was behind last weekend's suspected chemical attack on Douma, cabinet ministers had been summoned for a special meeting to decide how Britain should respond. The meeting lasted 2¼ hours, discussing not just the military options, but the politics too, it seems, and whether it's best to avoid a Commons vote when Labour seems adamantly against backing the Americans in strike action.
I want to see peace in Syria. I want to see an end to the war in Syria. That does mean America and Russia holding back, pulling back, and talking to each other. The dangers of bombing now, which could escalate the conflict beyond belief. Just imagine the scenario if an American missile shoots down a Russian plane or vice versa. Where do we go from there?
Pictures from Syria today showed Assad loyalists in Douma celebrating victory over the rebels, and Russian forces entering the town to reinforce the Syrian regime's position. But some conservatives think that attacking Syria now without a strategy would be wrong.
I think morally it makes sense, but I think strategically it's questionable now. Morally it makes sense because what's happening in Syria is appalling. We've had over 250,000 dead, several hundred or several thousand of those killed by chemical weapons. Strategically, it's difficult to know what we're going to achieve. It's too late to remove Assad, and with the Russians there is potentially very high cost.
David Davis, though, who opposed attacking Syria 5 years ago and is now a minister, says things this time are different.
You opposed David Cameron in 2013 when he went to Parliament and asked for authorisation to strike then. Have you changed your mind?
For 2 reasons. Well, I'll tell you the 2 reasons, and you draw your own conclusion. One was because we hadn't provided the evidence and intelligence that we knew who it was, and secondly, because there was not a proper plan which is thought through properly. Those 2 things, I'm sure, we're going to answer today.
The public is sceptical, it seems. A YouGov poll suggests 43% opposed, just 22% in favour.
I think there's better ways of doing it than actually military action. I think we're going to provoke people and we're going to actually set England up for a fall. We're going to radicalise more people.
I think people are slightly sceptical. So yes, I think they might say they go for military targets. I'm not convinced that they would. So I'd probably say no. Err on the side of caution, but they need to do something.
To a limited extent, yes. So it has to be targeted and it has to be effective on just what it is that they're after.
The government doesn't seem that keen on giving MPs a vote on the matter, even though some Tory backbenchers think that is an important principle and a right.
If you're going to take a country into war, which in effect this would be, I think it would be better if Parliament was consulted about the matter. I understand this is a recent development, but I still think it would be better if Parliament were consulted.
It's clear the government don't agree.
For most of the history of British government, military action has been taken purely at the executive level. It's an action of government rather than a decision of Parliament. There are reasons why that might necessarily be the case. I don't know whether that would be the case in this instance, but it's really only in the last 6-7 years that it has been the norm for Parliament to have a vote on military action.
In France today, President Macron said his government had proof that chemical weapons had been used, at least chlorine, he said. And tonight, US officials said urine tests from Duma showed chlorine and a nerve agent. Will Trump start World War III? Asked one headline in Moscow this morning, while the Foreign Ministry called on the international community to think of the possible consequences.
Michael Crick there. Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, joins me now. Lindsay, there were strikes against Assad's forces a year ago. 59 American cruise missiles fired after a chemical attack. We have another chemical attack now this Saturday. Is there a danger that if they do vote for some sort of military action, it could be therapy by cruise missile?
Well, I think that's what it was last time. They just hit one airbase, and what did it achieve? Very little. President Assad and his Russian and Iranian backers have gone on to improve their position and pretty much win the war. So the issue now is you don't have to be a peacenik to ask what is the point of this, because you can hit several air bases. The danger, though, is that the Syrians may be moving their armour rather near the Russian armour, so there is a danger of hitting Russian armour, which would be very dangerous. You can hit President Assad's palaces. He won't be in them, but that's a symbolic thing. What do you do then? What is the strategy? It's not like 2013 when you first had the big chemical weapons attack. At that point, Western intervention might have made a difference in the course of this war. Not now.
Are you saying that because the Russians are on the ground, the risk of escalation is greater than any kind of benefits of any military action in terms of changing Assad's course?
Well, what the Americans, the French and the British will be wanting to do is put President Assad in a position where he feels he has to come to the table. There has to be some kind of new negotiation, and they will be hoping that the Russians will back that. A lot depends on how strong President Putin is feeling. If he would like to get back a little from from being too involved in Syria, he might go for that. But if not, the danger of escalation is very great.
Okay, Lindsay, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me now from Nottingham is the father of the House of Commons, Ken Clarke, a former Chancellor and Home Secretary. Good evening to you, Ken Clarke. I mean, you're presumably in favour of a vote in the building behind me, is that right, if it comes to any military action?
Yeah, I would be in favour of proper, considered, well-targeted military action. Indeed, I think there should be a response, because it stopped Assad last time, and he's trying it on again because Trump had led him to believe he was pulling everything out of Syria and he'd lost interest in Syria, so he tried again. And if we don't actually take punitive reaction, then he will start using chemical weapons, because it's a quicker way of winning urban battles, and I think other groups will start doing the same thing in the Middle East. But it needs parliamentary approval first. I think the planned policy use of military force in a significant way is subject to parliamentary approval if we have an effective parliamentary democracy worth calling the name in modern times.
You're prepared to pick a fight with this over this with Theresa May, who doesn't want this to go to Parliament?
I don't know yet what Theresa May's opinion is. I don't know what her opinion was at the meeting this afternoon. Probably never will. Shouldn't leak from Cabinet. But in fact, I think, as I was one of those who forced Tony Blair reluctantly to have a vote on the Iraq War, as I approved of David Cameron submitting the decision to a parliamentary vote when he wanted to intervene in Syria, I think it's quite absurd to start invoking what I regard as the archaic argument of the royal prerogative, which means actually that the Prime Minister, with the advice of her cabinet, is put into a dictatorial position when it comes to making war against other countries. I don't think that's acceptable. I think it would be a further pathetic weakening of Parliament's power.
Right, and just one more on the vote. You're prepared to run the risk that this vote might go against any military intervention which you seem to be in favour of?
My views are based on what I think is the best modern constitutional practice. I don't say I want to vote when there's a Labour government in power, but I'm against having votes if it's a Conservative government taking action. I don't say I want a parliamentary vote if I think I'll agree with the result, but I don't want a parliamentary vote if I think I'll be in the minority. I happen to think there's a very good chance that the majority of Parliament would support well-judged, proportionate intervention.
Okay.
Jeremy Corbyn is nearly a pacifist. I don't think he's really representative of Labour opinion in the House of Commons.
We had 59 American cruise missiles aimed against Syrian targets after a chemical attack last year. That clearly didn't deter the Syrians from doing this again. And at the same time, we have the real risk of escalation because of the Russians on the ground. Are you prepared to take that risk?
Well, there are risks. I mean, this is a very tough, difficult decision. I have every confidence in Theresa May and the Cabinet. Having weighed it up carefully this afternoon, I wait to hear what they've decided, but I expect to find I agree with them. But the idea that you just allow the Russians to bluster us out of this in response to some typically silly President Trump Twitter interventions, all of which have muddied the waters, I think so long as we have well-judged, targeted, proportionate attacks at chemical weapon-related facilities, and so long as we don't start muddying the waters by going further into the Syrian conflict, I think that will have the necessary effect. I think Assad keeps trying it on.
But he keeps succeeding. He's winning this war.
And the Americans have lost interest in intervening.
But he's winning the war. You cannot reverse that.
I'm not suggesting that we should intervene in order to try to get Assad out of office. I think the West has abandoned the regime change argument. I'm not in favour of going into Syria with regime change arguments. I wasn't in favour of going into Iraq with regime change arguments. What I'm worried about is in all this Middle Eastern conflict, meaning we're creeping towards abandoning a decades-long period when the international order has stopped chemical weapons, nerve agents, gas attacks, start allowing that to come back into a cauldron like the Middle East and elsewhere, and the world will become an even more worrying place.
Got it over there. Ken Clark, thank you very much indeed. Now over to John in Washington. John.
Matt, as so often in these turbulent days here in Washington, Trump's tweets serve only to confuse the issue. Never truer than tonight over what America intends to do in responding to that Syrian apparent use of chemical weapons. Kylie Morris has been up to Capitol Hill today, where senators have been questioning what they say is a lack of coherence from the White House, whilst Defense Secretary Mattis is worrying about preventing the whole crisis from escalating out of control.
The president is keeping the world on a string, teasing Syria strikes, but petulantly blaming the universe for giving the US a decisive role.
We're looking very, very seriously, very closely at that whole situation, and we'll see what happens, folks. We'll see what happens. It's too bad that the world puts us in a position like that.
Forget the children of Duma. This is proving a real headache for Donald Trump. If his course is open to influence from anyone, it'll most likely be these two men, Defense Secretary General James Mattis and incoming Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Today is his confirmation hearing, where he's come under pressure on everything from the special counsel's Russia investigation to his hardline views on the Iran deal. But what loomed largest in the halls of Capitol Hill was the prospect of likely further military action in Syria.
Syria, is a strike on Syria a good idea? I'll be back. You'll be back?
For Senator Bob Corker, the Republican chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, there was no escaping questions over whether his president's threatened airstrikes are the right response.
What do you think of the position the president seems to be adopting at the moment?
I had a conversation with him this morning, and therefore I don't feel like I can speak to what I think his position is. It's my hope that we will execute those strikes soon.
Do you feel that there's a coherent policy to back that up at the moment?
I don't know. I hope that there is. I mean, we've made so many mistakes in Syria.
That's the senior Republican on foreign policy in Congress saying he doesn't know whether the Trump administration has a coherent foreign policy when it comes to Syria. And there's a reason for that. Actually, more than one, but this is indicative. President Trump, less than 2 weeks ago, explaining why he's had enough of Syria and why maybe it's time for the US to disengage.
You're inclined to pull the troops out?
I want to get out. I want to bring our troops back home. I want to start rebuilding our nation. We will have, as of 3 months ago, $7 trillion in the Middle East over the last 17 years. We get nothing out of it, nothing. So it's time. It's time. We were very successful against ISIS. We'll be successful against anybody militarily. But sometimes it's time to come back home.
Fast forward to today, and rather than withdrawal from Syria, further engagement is in play.
I think the only thing worse than a bad plan is no plan, and it seems clear to me that there is no plan from the Trump administration about how we're going to engage in Syria. Less than 2 weeks ago, President Trump was tweeting that we should withdraw promptly, something that I think is ill-advised. But now he's talking seriously about planning a significant strike and trying to enlist allies in joining us in doing so. I think he owes it to the American people, if he moves ahead with some military strike in Syria, to lay out a plan and to explain what are our priorities and values, and how does this possibly lead to a diplomatic resolution of a long-standing violent and grinding conflict.
As he briefed Congress, Defense Secretary James Mattis was asked directly what worries him most about possible military action in Syria.
There's a tactical concern, ma'am, that innocent people, we don't add to any civilian deaths, but on a strategic level, it's how do we keep this from escalating out of control? If you get my drift on that.
I get your drift. Thank you. I yield back.
Okay.
The risks of escalation are immediately apparent when you begin to consider what the options might be for an Allied strike on Syria. The Americans, the French and British all have significant military capabilities in the region, a mix of air and naval power that puts all of Syria within easy strike range. An American aerial assault would most likely be launched from the Incirlik air base in Turkey. And as for British planes, they'd likely fly from RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. As to potential targets, well, there are multiple Syrian air bases across the country, all potential strike options, and that's not counting other facilities suspected of storing or producing outlawed toxins like sarin or other nerve agents. The risk, of course, as General Mattis warns, is escalation. The Russians operate 3 military bases in the country and have threatened not only to shoot down any potential missile strikes, but also directly target the places the missiles were fired from, meaning not only ships and planes, but the very bases they were launched from could be within range of Russian retaliation.
We have not yet made any decision to launch military attacks into Syria.
The general says America is still weighing its options. In truth, they have only poor choices. But in the end, it will be the president who decides.
And Kylie joins me now here. Kylie, the president's in his rose garden. Has he said anything interesting yet?
No, he's holding a press conference currently. He's been talking a lot about China and trade and the great deals he's been cutting for the American worker, but nothing at this stage, certainly on his plans in Syria. He did make a reference in passing to the American military, boasting about its size and capacity. But beyond that, no. We know that he's meeting with some of the generals later in the day, and certainly there are plans afoot for this, but they're holding them very close to their chest currently.
But what's interesting in your report is that if the strongest voice was actually General Mattis, the Defense Secretary, who says he's really scared of escalating this thing.
Well, he is, and I mean, he's very explicit though too about the injustice that the Syrian people have suffered. I mean, he's other lines from him. He said that he'd never seen refugees as traumatized as those who'd left Syria, and he said it's got to stop. He also, interestingly, confirmed that potentially it doesn't need to be a precondition that the Allies come on board with the US before these strikes begin. So we may yet see the US do this unilaterally.
Well, now, joining us from the Washington Post is its associate editor and columnist, David Ignatius. David Ignatius, we have Britain in the form of Prime Minister May, France in the form of President Macron, both wanting to fire missiles into Syria, but without much capacity to do it. But America, which can, in something of a quandary. What are we to make of it?
Well, I think the best thing that's happened this week is that the process has been slowed down long enough for people to consider options carefully, to think about the risk of unintended consequences, to think very carefully about the danger of Russians getting killed in any U.S. or Allied strike. When this began with the Syrian attack on Douma on Sunday, the president was lashing out with a furious tweet, Russia will pay a big price. It looked like there might be some kind of spasmodic reaction. I think it is our Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, who slowed this down, got people to think carefully. and that's all to the good. They'll be making a decision this afternoon, our time, this evening in Britain. Every sign is that an American military response of some kind is likely, but I think it will be a wiser one for the time that was taken to wait and consider options.
You see, the tweets seem to suggest that the president has some sort of clue as to what he's doing, and yet, of course, they change so often that you sense that he doesn't. And the question is he going through all the normal levels of command and the rest of it in debating what to do in a sensible manner, or does he just shoot from the hip?
Well, he shoots from the hip, and then after the shot's fired, he holds a meeting to talk about what he was shooting at. I mean, this is what we've gotten used to with this president. The whole world can see it. My only point I'd make is that the process was slowed. I think the person responsible for that was Defense Secretary Mattis. One question we've had since Rex Tillerson was fired as Secretary of State was whether Mattis's authority, stature in the administration would be reduced. This week tells me that it hasn't been, that he's still crucial. Also, this is the first week for our new National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and again, the fact that the process has been delayed through the week, didn't happen instantly, is good.
Do you believe that unless Mattis, the Defense Secretary, can be persuaded that no Russian can possibly be killed, unless he can have that, they cannot risk missiles going into Syria?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. The danger of hitting Russians is present because they're so widely dispersed. All I'm certain of is that they've thought carefully about it. I think there's been communication with the Russians through this week in which there's more communication between the U.S. and Russian militaries in Syria than is generally understood. They talk almost every day. I think there has been talk this week, so it's an issue in people's minds.
David Ignatius, Washington Post, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Well, now let's fly back to Matt Fry in Westminster. Matt.
Thanks, John. Well, we have some information about what happened at the cabinet meeting today. Michael Crick is here. Michael, what did happen?
Well, it's still not entirely clear. I think basically it was fairly anodyne. They went through the intelligence, the evidence, the options. They haven't yet agreed what the official line was from the meeting, and I think where we do get it, it will be rather dull. What I don't think we're going to get tonight is Theresa May coming out and making an announcement or doing a big interview. There's still consultations going on, both internally and with our allies, and it's still a game of wait and see.
Rather dull?
In a way. I mean, I think actually the more interesting issue that's also going on is this whole question of whether Parliament gets a say in this. And I think there is nervousness in government that with Labour being so adamantly opposed, or at least the Labour leadership, that could be a huge risk. My own calculations are that the government would win such a vote. Right. But I think there's also privately, but also going on is an attempt to get rid of this convention that we've had for the last 15 years, ever since Blair in Iraq, this convention that Parliament should vote on these things. And I think there are elements within the government and the Conservative Party who'd like to use this as an opportunity to get rid of that convention and to restore the government's right to take military action without having to consult MPs. But there are a lot of parliamentarians, including Conservatives, who want to maintain that convention, which was originally brought in by Labour.
And we spoke to one just now, Ken Clark. Thanks very much, Michael. Well, with me now is Karen von Hippel, who leads the Defence and Security think tank, the Royal United Services Institute. Thanks for coming to Abingdon Green. As you heard Michael just say there, people want to restore the Parliament or keep the parliamentary vote alive. The question is, for what?
Yes, exactly. That is the question. What are they hoping to achieve? And although in my view, I think the importance of having the United Kingdom and the French involved in this will really give it more legitimacy and hopefully enable both of those countries to push the Americans to go back and really, let's just say, kickstart the peace process again. The peace process is essentially dead. It's now being run by the Russians and the Iranians. And who can possibly think what the Russians and the Iranians want in Syria will be good for the Syrian people?
But we had, we heard John and David Ignatius talking about this just a minute ago from Washington. There is a real danger here that once this news cycle is over, President Trump would have lost interest, and this could, to some extent, become another example of fire and forget.
It could be, but that's why what I'm hoping, and I don't have any any idea if this is actually happening, that a condition that the British government and the French government could make is we will get involved, we will lend you legitimacy, we will help you, but you have to bring everyone back to the negotiating table to push for a more equitable peace. Of course, it's never going to be perfect right now. I mean, the Syrian regime is really...
He's almost won the war, hasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, but it's a
Assad?
Pyrrhic victory. Don't forget, he does not have the capacity to control the whole country. His military is incredibly weak. He can't do anything right now without the Russians and the Iranians supporting him.
So if President Trump were to go for military action, presumably he would have to do more than he did a year ago, fire more missiles than the 59.
Right.
What targets does he hit? How does he change Assad's policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's really hard to know at this stage. He certainly could do enough to make an impact and to make them nervous. They already are nervous. You've seen the Russians and the Syrian regime trying to come up with all these stalling tactics, which worked a couple of years ago after the red line was crossed when they made a deal to remove all the chemical weapons. They're trying that again this time.
Is there a bigger question here, which is about whether Western democracies can actually go to war, wars of intervention, or have we basically lost that ever since Iraq?
Look, I think it's still possible, but it's very difficult when you have a United States president who really, as you say, he loses interest very quickly. You need to have meaningful diplomatic pressure following force. You can't just have force on its own. It needs to really be backed by a huge effort
Troops on the
by
ground
the diplomats,
as well,
etc.
which no one seems to have any appetite for.
I don't think they'll do that. I think it really
No.
will just be air power and more missile strikes, and maybe more than just a one-off. But it'll be a short endeavor, I think.
Okay, Karen Philippou,
Yeah.
thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you.
For 2 hours in Downing Street this afternoon, the Prime Minister and her cabinet debated whether Britain should be part of military action against Syria. The decision they came to this evening was yes. The cabinet agreed the use of chemical weapons by President Assad could not go unchallenged. But we don't know what form any action will take, nor when it will happen. President Trump seemed, if anything, to be rowing back today on the timing, as we'll hear in a moment. Here, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn kept up his call for Parliament to have a vote on the decision. MPs aren't due back at work until Monday. Theresa May and her ministers have not waited for that.
Are you convinced of the case for military action?
The answer around the cabinet table was yes. The Prime Minister told she had the backing of her colleagues to work with allies to coordinate an international response to deter the future use of chemical weapons. At the gates of Downing Street, a lone protester tried to block the Home Secretary's car. There are political obstacles in the way as well, not least calls for a vote in Parliament before any missiles are fired.
It does sound as if the Prime Minister has been given carte blanche to go ahead with whatever military action she is content that this country should join in as proposed by our allies. I can only hope that that action is and remains focused on deterring chemical atrocities in the future.
If the orders were given, these RAF warplanes based on Cyprus could soon be in action in Syrian skies. But here the Labour leader says MPs should be allowed to vote before any military action.
There has to be a proper process of consultation. We elect Parliament, we elect members of Parliament. They should have a voice in this. The Cabinet on its own should not be making this decision.
Allowing MPs to vote on military action is not a legal requirement, but it's become a parliamentary convention. In 2003, the Commons voted before British forces were sent to Iraq. But in 2011, a vote was held after airstrikes had begun in Libya. In 2013, MPs voted against military action in Syria, but operations against so-called Islamic State were approved by MPs 2 years later. If a vote was held this time, it could be tight. Of a dozen Tory backbenchers we spoke to today, 8 had their doubts.
We must never, never forget the terrible mistake when I and others were misled in Parliament and we voted to get involved in Iraq, which basically disabled world order.
MPs are back from their Easter break next Monday, which leaves little time this week to recall Parliament for a vote and raises the possibility that military action could begin before they return. The decision taken here today still leaves so many questions. When and how will Britain be involved in punishing the Assad regime? Angus Walker, News at 10, Westminster.
The timing and scope of any military action will be decided, of course, in collaboration with the United States. The word from Washington tonight is that President Trump will call Theresa May and President Macron in the next few hours. But caution is not a trait often displayed by Mr. Trump. But today he did seem to rein back on his tweet of yesterday that the missiles were coming. On Twitter this morning, he said a strike could happen very soon or not so soon at all. Later at a briefing, he was equally vague, saying simply, "We'll see what happens."
The Commander-in-Chief emerged onto the South Lawn this afternoon to discuss economic issues. But it is a military decision, one with enormous risks attached, that is dominating his agenda. And the President appears considerably more hesitant today than he was 24 hours ago.
We'll see what happens, folks. We'll see what happens. It's too bad that the world puts us in a position like that. But, you know, as I said this morning, we've done a great job with ISIS. We have just absolutely decimated ISIS. But now we have to make some further decisions. So they'll be made fairly soon. Thank you all very much.
A mile away on Capitol Hill, there was an explanation for why the gung-ho tweets have given way to caution.
We have not yet made any decision to launch military attacks into Syria.
The Secretary of Defense making clear that he has significant concerns about the unforeseen consequences of a strike on Syria.
There's a tactical concern, ma'am, that innocent people, we don't add to any civilian deaths and do everything humanly possible to avoid that. We're trying to stop the murder of innocent people. But on a strategic level, it's how do we keep this from escalating out of control?
Some in Congress picked up on that very fear.
Can you justify for the American people how going to war with Russia over Syria serves the interests of the American people?
No, Congresswoman, I can't answer that question. I'm not ready to speculate that that would happen.
But the worry of Russian retaliation is real. Moscow has significant forces, including air power, in the Assad heartland in western Syria, meaning that the airspace over the battlefield may be seriously contested. America is moving naval assets towards the Mediterranean, including the USS Harry Truman and its carrier strike group. Already deployed within missile range of Syria are 2 Navy destroyers, including the USS Donald Cook.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
There still appears to be the determination to punish the Syrian regime, but that does not mean there is a clear strategy, or that President Trump is prepared to bet his presidency on the risk of a direct military clash with Russia.
The shifting language from the president makes coalition building exceptionally difficult. So even as Britain and France line up behind the United States, the consensus here may be fraying, as it becomes clear once more how any military intervention in Syria can so easily spiral out of all control. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
And our political editor, Robert Peston, is here with me in the studio. Robert, she's got the backing of her cabinet, who's given her the green light. But how much of a test is this moment, do you think, for Theresa May?
Well, a terrific test. I mean, let's be clear. What we saw today was a decision that in future years may be seen as a historic decision because her ministers have authorised her to agree coordinated action with America and France to launch strikes against Assad to deter him from what an official described to me as further use of chemical weapons. President Macron today absolutely unambiguous that it was Assad who launched that attack. Now, this makes for an uneasy time for all of us. Nothing will happen, as I think you've already mentioned, until Theresa May has spoken to the US President. She's also expecting to have a conversation with the French President Macron. That means that we won't see any strikes tonight, but in my view there could well be targeted attacks on Syrian airfields and on sites that intelligence sources think are producing chemical weapons, maybe as soon as tomorrow night or over the weekend. The problem she's got, domestically is opinion polls show that the British people are very wary of this kind of military action. Lots of MPs are very upset that the Cabinet has taken a decision to authorise this action without any vote being held in Parliament. But there's something else which lots of MPs have said to me tonight that they feel uneasy about. They've seen very bold statements from the French president holding Assad to account, explaining why military action may be necessary. Of course, we've seen President Trump going back and forth on this issue, but nonetheless, the US administration seemed to be on the front foot. We haven't heard that much from Theresa May, and they say if we are to do this without looking as though we are holding on to the coattails of other countries, Theresa May has to come out and explain more fully why she thinks military action is necessary.
All right, Robert, thank you very much indeed. Well, in the Syrian town at the very heart of this whole confrontation, President Assad's forces are back in control. It was in Douma, near Damascus, of course, on Saturday, that pictures showed children suffering appallingly the effects of a gas attack. That final illegal assault, enough to end the resistance of rebel fighters there.
They're celebrating a victory secured in part by Saturday's gas attack. The surrender of rebel forces soon after the fumes killed dozens paved the way for these Syrian soldiers and their supporters to roll into Douma today and hoist the national flag. With them were Russian soldiers. These pictures illustrate how closely the Russians are enmeshed with the Syrian armed forces. For America and her allies, differentiating between the two when it comes to airstrikes will be no easy task. Tonight, the Assad regime is back in control of an area it lost 7 years ago. Those it regarded as enemies have been kicked out of town. Hundreds of miles from home, these are those vanquished, victims of ethnic cleansing by chlorine. When their president denied them even breathing space, they submitted to forcible removal by bus. Among them were this mother and her daughters, who are happy to be alive, having just managed to survive Saturday's gas attack. She described their escape from a basement, saying with every step she felt death taking hold, her body gradually being paralyzed. For the Syrian leader, this is all a success story reported on local television tonight. Pictured meeting a top Iranian official, the president reportedly said that Western threats are based on lies. He also accused Western countries of lashing out after losing their bet on rebels trying to oust him. The only definite losers in all of this are the defeated people sent into exile. They join hundreds of thousands of other banished Syrians for whom the foreseeable future is life in a tent. John Irvine, News at 10 in Beirut.
British, French and American military chiefs and politicians will make their decision on what action to take against Syria based in part on the available hardware. The US currently has just the USS Donald Cook in the region, a destroyer armed with Tomahawk missiles. Any strike it could muster would be similar to those undertaken last year. Their major asset, the USS Harry S. Truman-led carrier group, is still many days away, and that's thought to be possibly one reason why action has been delayed. France, on the other hand, has Rafale jets at bases in the United Arab Emirates and Jordan, while their frigate L'Aquitaine, armed with cruise missiles, is in the eastern Mediterranean. And then there is Britain. The Royal Navy is thought to have Tomahawk-armed submarines in the area, but the most useful asset is RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus, putting Syria well within range with its 8 Tornado fighter bombers and 6 Typhoon fighter jets currently on base. And our correspondent, Juliet Bremner, is there. Juliet, any indication that action is being prepared for or imminent?
Well, as you just pointed out, Akrotiri is ideally positioned just a few hundred kilometres from the coastline of Syria. If it's decided that the Typhoon fighter jets and the Tornadoes based here should be part of that allied strike force. And there's no doubt that the RAF pilots have extraordinary experience of flying those missions over Iraq and Syria. More than 3,000 bombs have been dropped over there, and we see them flying their training missions. But it has to be pointed out that to send any aircraft out over Syria is going to be far more risky than relying on cruise missiles fired from American warships. And that is simply because the Russians are now far more entrenched. They have this extraordinarily sophisticated surface-to-air missile system, which is believed to be capable of bringing down any kind of military jet. And of course, everybody's mind is still fresh on those words from the Russian ambassador to Lebanon, who said he would intercept the missiles and go for the places where they were coming from. And this Akrotiri base is well within Moscow's sights.
Thank you, Juliet, at RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. Finally, with Britain now committed, it seems, to joining military action against Syria, we end the programme tonight by looking at the decisions through the eyes of those with an understanding of what it will mean for Syria and, of course, what it will mean for us here in Britain. I've been hearing from three people with three very different perspectives about how we have come to this and where we go from here. Having failed to act when Assad used chemical weapons before, the US, Britain and France appear resolute this time to make the Syrian dictator and his Russian ally pay for such horrific attacks. Samir is a Syrian refugee who witnessed the uprisings against President Assad in 2012.
For people in Syria, what's matter is they don't have anything to lose. They already lost their lives, their families, their homes. Please, Theresa May, try your best to stop the killing. We are done with killing. I'm talking about civilian killings.
Against the hopes of exiled Syrians praying for an end to the war are the voices of those who've been asked to go to war on behalf of Britain. Sir Michael Graydon is a former head of the RAF.
Well, I think the first question that the Chiefs of Staff will be asking ministers is, what is your objective? Is it a long-term objective? Is it regime change? Well, I think we can assume it's not. So it's about punishing someone for what has been done, which breaks international law, which has gone across a red line.
And then there are those who have a transatlantic perspective. Karen von Hippel served in the US State Department during the Obama years. She says there are concerns Syria could become a real military flashpoint between Russia and the West.
Let's just say it's incredibly risky. The Russians have threatened to shoot not only the U.S. missiles, but potentially the platforms where the missiles are being sent from. So if they try to shoot down a U.S. warplane or a destroyer, a Navy destroyer in the Mediterranean, that is war, and that's where things will get very tricky. I don't think they will do that.
We have been here all too many times as a nation these past 18 years, from Afghanistan to Syria. All interventions begin with the aim of being temporary. As ever, history shows getting in is much, much easier than getting out. The future for Syria and for us.
We are no clearer tonight precisely what action America and by extension Britain is prepared to take after the apparent chemical attack on Douma in Syria. But the cogs are continuing to grind. The emergency cabinet meeting in Downing Street lasts for more than 2 hours this afternoon and agreed that the UK should continue to work with allies to coordinate an international response. It was vital that the use of chemical weapons did not go unchallenged, the statement after the meeting said, and the cabinet agreed on the need to take action to deter the further use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime. It offered few other details, with no mention of any parliamentary vote either. Donald Trump, who said on Wednesday that missiles were coming, today tweeted that he never said when. And tonight, the White House confirmed it's still assessing intelligence and that the president will speak to Macron and May later tonight. Well, I'm joined by our political editor, Nick Watt, and our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban. First of all, Nick Watt, a cabinet statement after cabinet that was actually short on any actual facts.
Very cautiously worded, but it does include this crucial sentence. Cabinet agreed it was vital that the use of chemical weapons did not go unchallenged. And what that means is the cabinet have given Theresa May the green light to launch military action if that is what is agreed with Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron. We're told that their discussions are going to be a genuinely collaborative effort, but I do have to say one minister did say to me we are essentially waiting to hear what Donald Trump is going to decide to do. Why are they deciding they need to do this? Well, the first thing is there's this fear that there's been this steady erosion of what is being described as the taboo over the use of chemical weapons, and a line finally must be drawn. And the second point is there was very, very strong support in the international community for the UK over Salisbury, and the UK cannot stand alone. But the thinking is they have a very difficult sort of course they have to navigate. On the one hand, if there is military action, it must deter future use of chemical weapons, but on the other hand, it mustn't escalate. And that will mean the UK saying sotto voce to Russia, you've won in Syria, you've achieved your strategic objectives, we accept that.
Right, so Parliament's back on Monday. No sign of any parliamentary vote.
Yes, I mean, the thinking in Whitehall is that the Prime Minister could go ahead with this without securing a parliamentary vote, whilst also at the same time abiding by the convention that has grown up in recent years, which tempers the use of these ancient prerogative powers, which basically allowed the Prime Minister to authorise military force without going to Parliament. And the way this would happen is they're pointing to a document in Whitehall drawn up in 2016 by the then Defence Secretary Michael Fallon. This was drawn up after David Cameron tried and failed to get the support of Parliament for military action in Syria. And this is what Michael Fallon said back then: in observing the convention, we must ensure that the ability of our armed forces to act quickly and decisively and to maintain the security of their operations is not compromised.
Thank you very much, Nick. We will come back to politics in a minute, but first, our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is here. I mean, we first heard from Donald Trump, you know, the big kind of, we've got nice, shiny new missiles, but what's been happening since then?
Well, as we've heard this evening, and in fact on successive evenings this week, he's not rushing into it. And of course, he's created a situation where there's an expectation of action. I think a lot of viewers would think, well, quite wise if you walk away. But of course, if you walk away, Russia will say this is because of what we said about being ready to respond, to shoot down American missiles and maybe even target the aircraft or other platforms that launch them. It will be presented by the Russians as a major victory. And make no mistake, the US military approaches this with trepidation. They've spent 20 years bombing either poor people in pickup trucks or broken states like Libya and Iraq. They're now up against a first world air defense system if they choose to fly over Syria. And that's causing them to think long and hard, to give cautious advice, and somehow to try and find a way in which they would do some sort of damage, but maybe tell the Russians where they were going to strike and that kind of thing, and not engage with the Russians. And that's a very narrow path.
All options are on the table and a final decision hasn't been made, but we'll keep you posted once it is.
The White House is trying to keep everyone guessing.
We'll see what happens, folks. We'll see what happens.
But in truth, its options and their possible consequences will have to be carefully considered.
Russia has been very threatening in stating that it would shoot down missiles, possibly even planes, used by the United States and its allies in any potential strike. Syria has also moved some of its aircraft to military bases, so that adds a layer of complexity because we would be striking now Russians and Syrians together, potentially.
Strategists often weigh military power in terms of capability and intent. And right now, limited coalition capability defines its options. Option A, just cruise missiles, could happen now, but isn't really on, because that's what America did last year, and it didn't deter Assad. Option B, add some stealth aircraft and other manned aircraft to the cruise missiles, but still deliver attacks from a distance in order to avoid Russian and Syrian defences. America and its allies could take this option also tonight. Option C involves suppressing Syrian air defences so there can be a sustained campaign against Syrian facilities. Well, the US and its allies don't yet have the number of planes, ships and missiles to do this. It could still take many days and carries risks.
Then we come back to the question, what was the purpose of the strike? Well, the purpose of the strike was to write down
the Syrian ability to use chemical weapons against their own population. You're not going to do that in one night. So we must expect the US-led coalition will come back again. And when they come back again, they'll want to reduce the chances of their missiles being struck. So the next iteration might mean that more capability is used against the Russian-provided air defense systems, and that, of course, is an escalation in itself.
But if America has considerable capability, what about its intent? What does President Trump, leading a coalition, want to achieve by these strikes? And does he have the political will to see it through, even if things go wrong?
I think the bigger question is, what is the political plan for the aftermath? Donald Trump, as president about a year ago, did move forward with missile strikes. But in the aftermath of that, nothing happened. And the signal that Assad took away was that you can hunker down and weather the storm, maybe a couple more missiles, but there won't be much more after that.
Of course, Russia has a key role in this too, and considerable military capability in Syria. It's deployed batteries of long-range S-400 air defense missiles to Tartus and Himimim. Add to that short-range systems at several more air bases and ship-based missiles some Russian vessels have put to sea recently, and Russia could create an air defense dome or bubble capable of intercepting missiles and manned aircraft alike.
The Russians have put in place in and around Syria some of the very best air defense capability that is in service in the world today. From a technical perspective, we should be in no doubt that this capability is a significant risk to Western aircraft, and to overcome it would require a major military effort.
The question, though, for the Kremlin is also about intent. Looking away and watching Assad's air force get pounded is hardly good for their regional image. If they activate their air defense system, it could have a dramatic effect, blunting the coalition's missile blitz. But if Russia tries that and fails, the effect will be the opposite. So big decisions for Russia also.
Mark Urban. Well, I'm joined now by Sir Mark Lyle-Grant, who was the National Security Advisor to Theresa May until last year and to David Cameron before that. And from Washington by David Frum, the senior editor at The Atlantic and a former speechwriter for George W. Bush. Good evening to you both.
Good evening,
First of all, Mark Lyle-Grant, what would you have been advising Theresa May if you'd been at her shoulder today?
I would advise that if the military come up with a credible military plan...
Which military?
Well, obviously it'll be the American military primarily, but in consultation with us and the French and maybe some others as well. If they come up with a credible plan, and if the Americans ask us to participate, then we should agree to do so. And the reason for that is that a very important red line has been crossed by the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime. And we, the United Kingdom, have a very strong national interest in defending this rules-based international order. And we shouldn't just rely on the Americans to do that for us. We have as strong as interest as they do.
But the reality is, although, you know, Theresa May was coming out of the cabinet today, the discussion was all about a joint enterprise. The truth of the matter is that having signed up, having rubber-stamped in cabinet, you know, Theresa May is actually going to be at Donald Trump's behest. There'll be nothing that'll be measurably altered by the fact that she's on that phone call, will there?
Well, the timing will be decided primarily by the White House, certainly. And that's an important point, because the timing is quite a tricky operation. Clearly, you want to plan very carefully. You want to make sure this is a targeted operation. You want to make sure that civilians are not going to be suffering as a result of this attack, and you don't want to give the Russians an excuse for escalation. But on the other hand, the longer the planning takes, the more obviously the Syrian regime and the Russians will prepare defenses. So getting that timing right is extremely important, and the decision will be taken primarily by the Americans. But, and this was the case in 2013, if Parliament had agreed in 2013 that we should join the Americans then, our participation in it would have been relatively small in terms of numbers, but nonetheless politically important.
David Frum, what do you take of what's happened in Cabinet today, that Theresa May is essentially having to fall in behind Donald Trump, and he would be the leader in this. This is a man who last week tweeted how he had nice shiny new missiles and they were going for you, rode back then this afternoon and said, we don't know when you're going to be hit, we don't even know we're going to hit you. What do you make of that as a kind of leadership? Is it actually very, very clever? Is it faux naive?
I think Theresa May is in exactly the position that almost every citizen of every democratic country is, which is looking to America for leadership and protection at a time when the presidency of the United States is radically broken. There isn't a functioning presidency, and it can't make proper decisions. And that's just something we can't blink. As you think about where this operation is going, that if the planes had holes in them and couldn't fly, if the boats were waterlogged, if the soldiers and sailors were aggrieved and mutinous, you would think very hard about launching an operation. And so it must be when your command structure is broken. We are treading a path to a really serious confrontation. 200 Russian so-called mercenaries were killed in a clash with Syrian militias and U.S.-led forces back in February. We are now on a path to a larger commitment under the leadership of a president who has questions over his connection to Russia, whose legitimacy inside the United States is seriously in doubt, and whose mental processes and leadership skills, we have all seen what they are. You don't, he's not a leader after whom you'd want to go to war.
Well, Mark Grant, you can't rely on Mattis, you can't rely on John Bolton. What essentially David Frum is saying here is that Donald Trump isn't taking us into a very dangerous place without actually working out the strategy or, in fact, what the end point is of all this.
The end point of this is pretty limited. We are not trying to change the outcome of the Syrian civil war. That is no longer possible, unfortunately. Had we decided to go ahead in 2013, had Parliament taken a decision to go ahead, and then Obama had struck then, I think, personally, that maybe hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved, and it could have affected the dynamic on the ground. But that time has passed. So the objective now is very limited. We're not talking about ground troops. We're talking about limited airstrikes, missiles, perhaps planes.
Would you have your fingers and toes crossed with the knowledge that this is being led by Donald Trump? I mean, or do you actually think it's being led by a lot of other people?
It's being led by the Americans, but the people who will be making the planning will not be Donald Trump, let's be honest. It'll be the Pentagon, the Defense Department, etc., who will be doing the planning, and we will be involved in that planning.
Well, David Frum, it's interesting that this is actually not really playing very high in the American press at all. But I wonder what would happen if you actually had a US fighter pilot shot down by a Russian fighter pilot in the air or shot down by a missile. What do you think might happen then?
Well, it's not playing very big in the United States at this minute because in the past half hour, the biggest news story is the president's personal attorney pled the Fifth Amendment to charges that the president was paying back blackmail money to a porn actress. And that is our life now in the United States. And it seems debased and tabloidy to raise it, but it is crucial to understanding how the decisions will actually be made. That's not a sideshow to the more important issues of war and peace. That is absolutely integral. That is what Donald Trump is actually thinking about most of the time after fulminating about what he sees on television.
Is this whole Syria business a way of Donald Trump deflecting, just deflecting?
That makes it sound too rational. It's not like he's got one problem and so he comes up with a plan. He's got a series of fitful impulses. David Brooks nicely compared Donald Trump's thought processes to fireflies inside a jar. They wink on, they wink off. And you have to take that into account when you're deciding where we go. Because
let me put that to Mark. Sorry, can I just put that because we're running out of time?
Limited.
I just want to ask you finally. We're in a situation. Sorry, we're in a situation where, he used chemical weapons a year ago. He has stockpiles of chemical weapons. He has shown absolutely no regard for the international community. You hit him with even 59 cruise missiles, a couple of sites, and he'll go again, won't he, until he's absolutely squashed every piece of opposition in Syria. Essentially, what's the point? And we've lost the game.
Well, no, because you are sending a very important signal that there will not be impunity if regimes use chemical weapons. And that is extremely important, Kirsty. It's a message not just to Assad, but to other regimes around the world who might think, oh, well, why don't we add chemical weapons to our stock of weapon systems? That would be very, very damaging.
Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, with the news that President Trump and the Prime Minister are speaking tonight, action against Syria may well be coming, and it seems that the decision, whatever it is, will not be put to Parliament. There's little doubt now that Jeremy Corbyn would vote against. He said today, more bombing, more killing, more war will not save life. It'll just take more lives and spawn the war elsewhere. So, should Parliament have its say? Here in the studio is Catherine West, Labour MP and former Shadow Foreign Minister, and the Conservative MP, Johnny Mercer. Good evening to both of you. It looks as if you won't have a vote if there's going to be action. You're just going to have to wear that.
Kirsty, I don't see why we can't be recalled on Saturday or Sunday. I could easily cancel engagements, and I think most MPs are back now because Parliament is sitting on Monday. So we should be in the House of Commons debating this crucial issue on Saturday or Sunday. So I'm just waiting for the Speaker to email me overnight so that I can be in Parliament Saturday and we can have a discussion about this most important topic.
Well, Johnny Mercer, I mean, the longest-serving Conservative MP, Ken Clarke, was perfectly clear today that actually there should be a vote in Parliament because, in fact, the Cabinet has got to be accountable to Parliament, not because, and if it's inconvenient, too bad. You have to have that vote.
I don't think it's a question of convenience. This argument that you must go through Parliament to conduct self-defence or military action is just intellectually bankrupt. If you look at the decisions, how these are made, and the intelligence that goes into these decision-making processes, they will never come into the public domain, and they never should, because they will burn service. No, let me finish, Kirsty. They will go to the intelligence services will produce things that could never go into the public domain. Okay, so MPs are always going to be debating things with half of the information, so they could never come up with the right answer based on that. The Prime Minister and the National Security Council, we elect them, and they look at the information, and they make their decision based on that. And that's how a democracy works.
Kirsty, Chilcot could not have been clearer about the three conditions. Number one, that the intelligence must be robust, which of course in Iraq it wasn't. Number two, that there must be a plan, which there's no plan. And number three, that you must try and bring the public with you. And that bringing the public with you surely means debating in Parliament and having some transparency about the possible escalation
so
of this
even someone
situation.
like, you know, even Emmanuel Macron saying that he's absolutely sure that at least chlorine was used. Do you believe him? You disbelieve him?
I have no doubt that terrible crimes have been committed and that Assad needs to come before the International Criminal Court.
So at what point, though, under what circumstances, would you actually back military action then against Assad?
Well, I think we need to see the evidence, and that needs to be put forward to members of Parliament so that we can ask the Prime Minister some questions.
Johnny Mercer is here saying that the security forces know things that they couldn't possibly share with parliamentarians.
No, but I think what the Cabinet can do is to give us a steer on some of the information which they had today for their decision.
I don't disagree with the fact that the Prime Minister has a duty, when this country is engaged in military operations, to come forward, to advocate and to bring the country with her. I don't dispute that for a minute. But the fact that you can lay everything out that contributes to your decision-making cycle at the risk of making this country less safe because it will burn assets that we can never use again is intellectually bankrupt and makes us less safe. But I accept that ministers and the Prime Minister has to come out and advocate.
Well, but right now, what we don't have, and there may be you know, evidence after the phone call tonight, but you must be really concerned that we do not seem to have a strategy. There is no end point. There's no actual agreement about what's happening here. You know, is it, you know, Assad, we now agree, is going to be left in place? Is it, you know, is it because you think the opposition is too toxic to actually back the opposition now, or is it busted flush?
Kirsty, you're not going to get a result. Whatever the West does in this, you're not going to shift the dial on the civil war in Syria. But that's not what we're trying to do. As Mark has just pointed out there, it's a signal about chemical weapons, and it's really important we do that.
12 months ago, Mr. Trump did do a strike. I want to know what the government's assessment of the efficacy of that strike was, because here we are a year later being asked to do the same thing. I want to know how can we get beyond this? 8 years on and people are still suffering. We need peace, we need to get round the table, and we need to talk and talk and talk and not do more dropping of bombs which will kill more people.
But isn't there a problem with the Labour Party that it completely always eventually returns to Iraq? And you cannot base, Jeremy Corbyn cannot base his foreign policy on the hangover from Iraq.
But could I just say, Kirsty, at least with Iraq we had a rational partner. I mean, if Mr. Johnson, our Foreign Secretary, was going to pick up the phone to his opposite number in the US, who was appointed today, I mean, what do we know about this man who was appointed today? It's just chaotic.
Well, let's not talk about the man who was appointed. Let's just very quickly go back to the question of the President of the United States and what David Frum said. You know, and do you trust someone like the President of the United States to have a strategy to do the long-term plan for Syria and actually avoid the possibility of escalation with the Russians?
Look, Donald Trump is the president at the moment. He is the post holder in that job. But I am absolutely confident that there is a security structure around him in people like Jim Mattis, who absolutely are coordinating. It's the Department of Defense. I know what you're saying. You look at Donald Trump, you look at his tweets, and you think this is quite a scary situation. But that enhances Britain's role. Britain needs to get in there as part of this alliance to temper some of that, but at the same time to resiliently say we are not going to tolerate the use of chemical weapons.
Thank you both very much.